all voices. One of our audience members asked if we could have a moment of silence. Lynn Sulima from Hornell.
Close enough. Good evening, friends. I'll bet everyone in this room could use a quiet moment today. Whether you're angry, frustrated, confused, or grieving. Wherever your heart is tonight, in Texas, in Florida, in Puerto Rico, in Las Vegas, join me in a moment of silence for that. And let's get down to business.
Thank you, Lynn. This evening we'll learn about the democratic institutions of the Constitutional Convention, endearingly called CONCON, and the referendum, which affords us the opportunity for direct participatory democracy. Thing is, most New Yorkers don't know much about it, but they'll vote on it anyway. According to Winston Churchill, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. You are clearly above average by virtue of being here. And that's helpful because, as JFK warned, the ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of all. Holding New York CONCONs every 20 years used to be fairly routine, but New York State has not held one for the last 50 years, 1967. This year, the New York State League of Women Voters board is voted to support a yes vote on the referendum. This is an extraordinary development. During the mid-20th century, the League was a great champion of state CONCONs. But for the last 30-some years, it has either been neutral or opposed. New York State League of Women Voters President Dare Thompson explained the change this way, quote, "We will be supporting the convention as a rare opportunity for citizens to take control of government and enact voting, ethics, and redistricting reforms. We have been urging these same reforms for many decades and getting nowhere. This past year, the leaders of both houses were convicted on corruption charges, and even then, the legislature failed to adopt meaningful reform. The option of a convention was put in the Constitution specifically for those times when the government was not responding to critical issues. It was intended to give citizens the power to act when the government will not. It is hard to argue that this is not such a time." End quote. Since our program is co-sponsored by a chapter of the League of Women Voters, I want to make it clear that we didn't design it with the intention of promoting the board's viewpoint. Individual League members will vote as they wish and not in unison. That said, we understand that many of you are looking for information to help you cast an educated vote. In addition to what our accomplished speakers tell us, our handouts may help you. These provide, among other things, a wide variety of reasons why people support or oppose a referendum. Two distinguished political science scholars have graced us with their presence, and we'll talk about the history, process, and delegate selection, and the special purpose of a CONCON and referendum, and the vital role it can play in a democracy. There will be a question and answer period when our speakers finish, and an open mic opportunity later. Now I'm honored to introduce our speakers in alphabetical order. J.H. Snyder, disguised here as Arfaxad Loomis, is the creator and editor of the definitive New York State Constitutional Convention Clearinghouse. He has a PhD in government from Northwestern University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He has been a fellow at several institutions, including Harvard and Northwestern. While in Washington, D.C., he was an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow in Communications and Public Policy. He is the founder of iSalon. Jim Twombly is an award-winning professor of American politics at Elmira College. He earned a PhD in political science from SUNY Stony Brook. At SUNY Buffalo, he was an assistant professor of political science as well as an assistant dean for educational technology. He has run for public office and is a political analyst for WENY-TV. One of his forthcoming books has the intriguing title, Sex, Power, and Cover-Ups, Political Scandal in American Pop Culture. Both speakers are widely published and have an extensive curriculum vitae far beyond my introduction. There is more information about them in the red folders on the back table if you want to pursue, see what else they've written in articles and books. So I think we'll start with J.H. Snyder.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
So as Karen mentioned, I'm dressed as Arfaxad Loomis. So you're all here because you know you've got a ballot question on November 7th on whether to call a constitutional convention. And that got put in New York's Constitution in 1846, the 1846 Constitutional Convention. And I would say if anybody should get credit for A, that Constitutional Convention, and B, that provision, is Arfaxad Loomis, somebody who I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. He was from upstate New York, and actually the key people who created this institution were from upstate New York. So we'll come a little bit back to Arfaxad at the end, but basically I think he's underappreciated, and I think we study a lot the framers of the national constitution, and you should understand why they put this provision in the Constitution. There was a lot of thought behind it. So if I could start with just asking a few questions of the audience. How many of you studied the federal Constitution when you were in school? Most of you. How many studied your state constitution when you were in school? Actually, that's more than I thought. How many of you studied any of the 9, or depending on how you count it, 11 state constitutional conventions when you were in school? Okay, none. Most of you, if you studied the federal constitution, you did study you've had one federal constitution.
You ever asked what state we're from, though?
Okay, that's not. Now, this is a more open-ended question. What is the function of a constitution? Now, this is a little bit of a trick question because over the last 2,000 years, the concept of a constitution has changed a lot. And you might think from the American perspective, what is the function of a constitution? Would anybody have any thoughts that they'd be willing to share? Again, there's no correct answer, but what comes to mind when you think of what a constitution is for, what it achieves? Go ahead.
A guideline that we all agree to live by?
Okay, good. And a lot of people think it's a sacred document. If it's a sacred document, you should at least appreciate why it's such a sacred document. Go ahead.
It codifies the structure of the government.
Very good, yes, it allocates the power among our different government agents, the judiciary, the legislature, the executive branch, and local government. And it retains powers to the people. Now, where does the legitimacy of the Constitution come from? What makes, it embodies the source of legitimate power. And where is that power in our democracy? From the people. And that wasn't always, when Moses got his covenants, it was from God. When Solon and Lycurgus got there, they were charismatic individuals. In England, the Constitution, it was just tradition. Time immemorial, the customs, that was their custom. But in America, it's we the people. That's how most constitutions start. It represents the will of the popular sovereign. That is what is embodied in the Constitution. So it allocates power among the various government agents, and its source of legitimacy is popular sovereignty. Not the sovereignty of the king or parliament, but people. So now I would like to focus on what is the democratic function of the periodic constitutional convention. And just a little bit, nobody had a problem thinking about constitutional amendment until we had this modern idea of a written constitution that embodied the people's will, because if God was giving you a constitution, it didn't matter, or some charismatic individual. And it actually was a big problem that took a long time in America to think out, because we had this new way of thinking about a written constitution, what a constitution represents, how to go about amending it. It's pretty important if you have a constitution, you have a vehicle to amend it. And the specific question I'm addressing here is, what is the function of this particular amendment process? So New York has two amendment processes. One is a legislatively initiated amendment process, and that's the one most of us are familiar with. That's the one that's most widely used. But we have a second amendment process that was very important to Arfax and Loomis and others, which is to provide a vehicle to bypass the legislature, because otherwise the legislature has complete gatekeeping power over constitutional reform, and that's a problem, because there's some types of reforms that would not be in the self-interest of the legislature to pass. So central to the way the framers thought is that these two amendment processes are not substitutes, as often claimed, but they are complements. So you can't say that you can do everything you want with the legislative initiative process. You need this second amendment process. They are substitute mechanisms with different purposes, so that's important. Now we're going to talk about the process of a constitutional convention, and we're going to link this notion of what the function of a constitutional convention is to the process. Now, there are no perfect processes in democracy, so we have the function, and there's always going to be a little bit of a gap between the process and the function. We all know this. We read about scandals and all sorts of things. Democracy doesn't work perfectly, but I think as a mechanism to implement a constitutional convention, this is actually a legislative bypass mechanism. It's remarkably effective. So we're going to start with the first step, and that is that the people, this is the one you're going to engage in on November 7th, you have the right to call a constitutional convention. So why is it so important that you have a right periodically to call one? And so the core idea was, because a constitutional convention is a check on the legislature. A legislature would not voluntarily, generally, unless they're extreme situation, call one, because why call something that would be used as a check on your power? Now, just to sort of test this idea out, why do constitutions routinely have provisions for periodic election of legislatures? Similar principle, but why the colonists really fought. In the charters and early democracies did not have periodic elections for legislatures, and Americans decided it was vital to include in constitutions periodical elections. We don't have them just for legislatures, we have them for the executive branch and the judicial branch. But why is periodic elections so vital in a legislative context? It's the same basic logic. Would anybody care to express why it's all 50 state constitutions mandate periodical elections for the legislature? Anybody wanna? Okay, good, we got it.
So we can get rid of people we don't like?
That's a good one. Well, okay, but does anybody have any other idea? That's, in the context of checks and balance system, that's more of an intra-branch accountability analysis. That's a technical term, I apologize. But anyway, during colonial times, and in England, if the king didn't like what was going on in Parliament, he would prorogate, which is cancel it or not call it. And this was a big problem in English history. And if you left the legislature in charge of when they would have another election, they might just keep postponing it, which is what the English Parliament did after 1688 in the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament became sovereign as opposed to the king. They postponed their own elections. So it's a checks and balance. You don't want to give the governor control of when the legislature meets and vice versa. And the same applies at a higher level of abstraction to a constitutional convention. You don't want to depend on a branch of government to call it. So that's why the automatic periodicity is important. So you're not depending on the legislature to call it, because it wouldn't allow this bypass mechanism to happen. So now that's the first step. The second step, explaining it, is you get to vote for convention delegates. So why would the framers not want to leave? All 50 states have a constitutional convention process. It's considered by the courts an inalienable right of the people. They don't view that way about legislative initiated amendment, but they view that about the constitutional convention process. So why would you want to leave the legislature in control of proposing amendments? Why was the constitutional convention process invented, and why is it considered so essential? From a democratic theory perspective, anybody have any ideas? Well, anyway, this gets more technical. So basically, you don't want the legislature in charge of limiting or expanding its own powers, because it would have a conflict of interest doing it. So the Constitutional Convention mechanism was a compromise. It wasn't practical to have all of the sovereigns come together and deliberate. The society was too large, but they didn't want to have the legislature doing it either, because they would have a conflict of interest in creating the form of government under which they were directed. So it was viewed that we needed to have this independent constitutional convention process, and many scholars believe that this institution is America's greatest contribution to the development of democracy worldwide. The written constitution and the constitutional convention, which were viewed as part and parcel of the same thing. It is part of this idea that it has to be independent of the legislature. So that is the second process. Now, the second vote. Now I want to now jump, this is the convention convenes, but the third critical element is the popular vote. So, the basic idea here is that a constitution is the people's law. It has to, because it represents the popular sovereign. The sovereign has to vote on it. You would not want, again, the legislature being able to not only propose law, but to pass it into law, because they would have a conflict of interest in doing it, because you can't have the agent controlling the agent's powers. You need this separate mechanism, and this is common to both. Unlike steps 1 and 2, both legislative initiative amendments and constitutional convention proposed amendments have to go to popular ratification. It's viewed as an essential check. You can't have a popular sovereign unless the popular sovereign ratifies constitutional changes. So that's essential to modern democratic theory. If you are attacking this third provision in a constitutional convention process, you're attacking basically the whole underlying democratic theory of constitutionalism, because it's the same for both methods. So that's pretty important to keep in mind. So now I'd like to move to the history of this institution and a few comments, and I'm going to show you a little slideshow I put together. Thomas Jefferson is most closely associated with this institution, and Jefferson's idea, which he came to fairly late in life, was that the people should have an opportunity once a generation to revisit their Constitution. And his view was that, as he put it, the earth belongs to the living. We should not allow the dead hand of the past to control our constitutions. After all, he didn't use these words, but sort of these were, you know, white, super wealthy individuals who came from a very different world than we do. Most of them didn't have higher than a high school education, and presumably we've learned a lot. The world is quite different, and our institutions should change with changing times. That was Jefferson's idea, and I'll just read here this quote, by the way, is, I don't know how many of you have been to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's one of really the two featured memorials, well, Lincoln, Washington, and Jefferson. And this big statue of Jefferson, and then just to the right of Jefferson is his Declaration of Independence, where he said that Americans had an inalienable right to alter their Constitution, and one of the inherent natural rights. And by the way, of all the rights we have, we forget, we talk about all these rights, the right to reform your Constitution is considered one of the most important, and generally considered by the courts one of the few inalienable rights we have. And 37 of the 50 states in their Declaration of Rights states that the right to alter your Constitution is an inalienable right of the people. New York actually is an exception, but then we have this other detailed provision. So I'll just read the famous Jefferson quote, which is on the left side. So we got the Declaration of Independence on the right, and this other quote, which was very inspiring in the middle of the 19th century, through the 20th century. I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change, with the changes of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy at civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. So that's a whole idea that constitutions should not be internally fixed, but should evolve with time. And certainly those that have read New York's Constitution, almost a third of it has become obsolete because the federal Constitution trumps state constitutional law. And over time, with Supreme Court decisions and whatnot, much of the New York Constitution has been made obsolete. That's one type of obsolescence. There are many other types of obsolescence. So it's sort of embarrassing to read the document and you think you're reading a definitive law and it isn't. Go ahead. Yeah, we have general questions afterwards, but if, on this
point, the U.S. Constitution preempts the state constitution.
That's right, yes. As well does federal law.
It's preempted. You're saying that the New York rights that are preempted are now obsolete. But if the federal convention overturns the changes in the federal constitution, then the New York rights are no longer obsolete because they will stand alone, separate from the U.S. Constitution. So just because a right is no longer fashionable, does that mean we should change it?
Okay, that's a slightly different question, but the core idea is that we have a hierarchy of law. Just like constitutional law is higher at the same level of government than statutory law, which is higher than regulatory law. Federal law, whether it's constitutional or passed by Congress, is a higher law than state law. There are some exceptions, but basically, if the Supreme Court makes a decision in an area that has jurisdiction at the state level, it trumps a state law. So now if I'll move on to this little presentation, and I don't expect you to pick up the details, just the sense of, this describes New York's 11 state constitutional conventions since 1707. Just pick up a little bit of the feel of how things have changed, and the tendency until really the late 20th century to have a state constitutional convention in New York every generation. So the constitutional tradition grew out of the charter tradition. The king would create charters with his colonies, and then they turned those into constitutions. Perhaps the biggest change is the king was sovereign in relationship to the charters, and then the people became sovereign when we developed constitutions, our constitution. So I read that. Jefferson's writings were not on this issue were not really made public until his letters were published in 1829, and that was when this institution really began to take off in the United States. So there's two types of state constitutional conventions. The ones that we're focusing on here, which is to propose amendments, but we have also a type of state constitution to ratify federal amendments. And the one we know best from school is in 1788, we had a state constitutional convention to ratify the federal constitution. We also had one in 1933 to ratify the 21st Amendment. There's two mechanisms at the federal level, a state constitutional convention and the one you know best, which is the legislature ratifies. So anyway, we're focusing here on the 9 state proposing conventions, or state constitutional conventions we had. So the idea here is the world has changed a lot. This was the ratification of the federal constitution. We had a full-fledged state convention to ratify the federal convention proposal. Alexander Hamilton was the key fellow at the state convention. He was less influential at the federal convention in 1788. Now, between 1777 and 1821, the only way to change the Constitution in New York was through constitutional conventions. It wasn't until 1821 that they created the legislative initiated amendment process. And that's fairly typical because the states all started off pretty much with the Constitutional Convention, and then for modest things, it was more affordable, simpler to allow the state to do it. So between 1821 and 1846, there actually was not a concrete provision for a constitutional convention, and the 1846 folks said, that's not acceptable, we need a more independent mechanism, and out of that came the 1846 convention, Facts and Loomis, and the periodic constitutional convention referendum, which 14 states now have, and New York was very influential in getting other states to adopt this institution. This convention also further specified the convention process because it took 8 years. The voters approved the convention in 1886, but they didn't actually convene until 8 years later because of fights in the legislature. So they created a better specified mechanism to prevent those type of fights. And that's, so the version you have now was really created in 1894. So this is one of the a federal ratifying convention of the 21st Amendment with repealing the ban on prohibition.
Now it's done, brothers, can you spare a dime?
Now, one thing I haven't mentioned is the norm in New York history is to propose multiple amendments at a constitutional convention. They didn't do that in 1967. What you normally do is you put the non-controversial amendments in one large package, and you put the controversial ones that might not pass in separate votes. That's what was done in 1938. There were 9, but the first one was a bundle of proposals that were non-controversial, and they put the other 8 more controversial ones in separate amendments. That's the way you should decide the ratification votes. In '67, they actually came up with a very good constitution, basically, but there was a poison pill that put it all together, and that was enough to defeat it. I have an article coming out very shortly on the poison pill element of the '67 convention. Okay, so that's enough of that. So the basic feeling that I hope you'll get is New York has evolved a lot. It's grown, it's become more complex, there are different problems, and constitutions solve different problems. They're not eternal documents, they have to adjust for the times. Now, a little bit about the politics. This is my last section here of the Constitutional Convention. 4 points I'd like to make about the politics. First of all, those that tend to oppose a constitutional convention are those that do well with the legislature. The core opposition typically comes from heavily regulated groups that have a good track record in the legislature. A constitutional convention is much riskier for them. They don't have as much control over the process. It's much more of a majoritarian type of institution. So that tends to be the core of the opposition. Second point is that the attitudes of various groups towards constitutional conventions have changed a lot over time based on their relative power. So basically, since the 1970s, or really the 80s, government unions have been very strongly opposed to constitutional conventions, but in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when they were weak, they were great advocates for the process. Basically, at the time it was business, big business, especially the trusts, the railroads, and the groups that had tremendous control of our legislatures were opposed, and the more populist groups favored them. And much of what people fear losing from a constitutional convention came in the New Deal Convention of 1938. That's when labor got its pension and other rights, and was a great champion of the institution. Now that they have been very successful with the legislature, they prefer that mechanism, and they mistrust this mechanism. So the politics have evolved. Unfortunately, it has evolved in a very unfavorable way. I have an essay on how the politics have evolved since 1777 to the present. I mean, in Arphaxad Loomis's day, you had 50% turnover in the legislature. Farmers were by far the most common type of legislature. They were not career politicians. They didn't make their money they didn't look as this is the career. Legislations have always been opposed to conventions, but the level of opposition when you have a professional legislature is much greater. And early on, you know, you had maybe big business that had a lot at stake with it opposed, and now you have the legislatures, you have big business and big labor. It's sort of like impossible politically, this institution in the last, few decades, when you have that type of very sophisticated opposition. So that's a big change. A critical element in the politics is the no campaigns focused on the second part of the process, the delegate selection. I don't want to talk about the third part, the popular ratification. So that's just in the framing. We're going to talk a lot about the potential corruption in the second part. The third part is sort of awkward because both legislative initiated amendments and constitutionally initiated amendments have to be ratified. So if you attack that part of the process, you're really attacking all types of constitutional amendments. So I would argue that the most critical part of the process is the third part, because that if a constitutional convention is just able to propose things, and you have the right to, reject them. And to me, that is the most critical step in the process, that final one. But if you look at how it's debated publicly, you'd often never know that third step exists, because there's so much focus on the second step. So, and then the last point I'd like to make is that the no campaigns tend to say that the Constitutional Convention mechanism is a substitute, not a complement, meaning you can substitute legislative initiative amendment for a Constitutional Convention, and obviously this. So these are importantly different types of institutions. They're complements, and you can't say that, we have this other system that's more efficient that can solve the same type of problems that a Constitutional Convention was designed. So those are four critical political differences, and I'd like to close with, we got a quote earlier from Winston Churchill. This is a different Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill said that democracy was the worst form of government except all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. And I think that sort of encapsulates my view of the state constitutional convention. It's the only mechanism we have in New York to bypass the legislature and propose an amendment. It isn't a perfect system like democracy isn't, but it's the only one we have. And if you're throwing it out, the baby with the bathwater. The goal, if there are problems with the institution, and I think New York has one of the better constitutional convention systems, partly because it leaves less discretion to the legislature. We ought to fix any problems at the next constitutional convention, but it's a vitally important institution, and like all forms of democracy, it's got some warts, but it's an institution that we should really cherish as something extraordinarily valuable. So that's it. And just on my particular interest is that I am interested in defending this institution, which gets badmouthed a lot in the day-to-day politics. I'm less focused on the things that you're probably most concerned about, which is what exactly is a constitutional convention going to do or not do. I'm interested in why we have this institution and why it's incredibly valuable. We don't want to badmouth this institution. We might argue that it's not the appropriate time or something like that. But where my line is these attacks. It's like attacking democracy. A lot of people do it. You go to Russia, you go to Iran and whatnot. There are plenty of reasons that sounds sort of reasonable to attack democracy, but I don't think we should be attacking this institution as an institution. So that's where I'm going from. And hopefully Jim will give you some more practical views.
Good evening. I'm Jim Twombly. Some of you probably recognize me, I hope you do, from WBNY. I want to start off by noting that in Jim's presentation, one of the things that's important, I think, is to understand Alexander Hamilton was key in the New York State ratifying convention You might also recall, he was one of the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers were written to defend the ratification of the federal Constitution, but primarily to elect delegates in the state of New York favorable to that ratification. That's what the purpose of the Federalist Papers were. And then they became very, very popular and began being published as editorial or op-eds in newspapers all across the country, starting with Philadelphia. I agree with much of what Jim said, that a constitutional convention, in theory, is a wonderful little d democratic institution, and we should champion them. I think we need to put New York's process in context. We have a 20-year periodicity, along with 7 other states do that every 20 years, automatically by constitutional fiat. The state must put on the ballot a referendum to the voting public, the question whether or not they want to hold another constitutional convention. There's 1 state, Michigan, that does 16 years, 4 states that are every 10 years, 1 state, Hawaii, is every 9. Why 9? I don't know. Why even 16? That's kind of odd too. Others are only by a vote of a majority or supermajority of the state legislature. Some are coupled with the consent of voters in a referendum, but there's no periodicity required. 4 states use citizen-initiated petition to call for a convention, and 7 states have no specific mechanism in their constitution to call for another constitutional convention. Those 7 states are Arizona, Arkansas, Indiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, Texas, and Vermont. Oregon allows for a convention, but its constitution is somewhat vague about how one is called. Most states require that any product of a convention be put to a vote of the public in a referendum. So, yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity in state constitutions about the process, and I would agree that New York is best, one of the best at least, in terms of detailing what the process is. I would agree, I would argue that perhaps maybe 20 years is perhaps a bit too long. How many of you remember the great debate that we had in 1997 about whether or not to have a constitutional convention? 1. We don't remember 20 years back. And I think that if, if we're going to follow the Jeffersonian notion of every generation, maybe we need to go a little bit sooner than every 20 years. And I would argue that that probably would be a better little d democratic process to have that referendum sooner. How do we select delegates? Well, in New York, it's 15 at-large delegates elected statewide and 3 per senatorial district, state senate district. The math was what? 204, I think, was the total number. Somebody can check my math on that. 204 sounds like a nice number. But how many of you live in a state senate district that is dominated by a party not your own? 2/3 of the room. So there's a little bit of a problem politically with the process. You might end up electing 3 delegates from your state senate district, none of whom agree with you politically. And as Jim and I were discussing beforehand, I'm in one of those districts. And it is not likely that I could get elected delegate to the state constitutional convention. Yet you would think that somebody who teaches state and local government, constitutional law, American government and politics, maybe should be at a convention like that. I probably couldn't get elected. I'll have to hope that somebody appoints me to the staff. None of our states use different mechanisms for selecting. Colorado uses state senate districts. California uses equal population districts, whatever that means. Delaware has a detailed description of how delegates are chosen. including use of representative districts and some other allocation from counties. I tried reading through it over the weekend, and I fell asleep in the middle. Florida's constitution refers to selection within representative districts, unless there's a colloquialism that refers to a specific, like, lower house representative. I've sort of lost track of what they were talking about. Georgia just says population as near as practicable. Hawaii leaves the number of delegates and method of selection up to the legislature. Guess what the districts will probably be in Hawaii? Idaho, double the number of the representatives of the most numerous branch of the legislature. And that's a quote from their constitution, most numerous branch of the legislature. Illinois seems to imply that it's, the delegates are elected from the same districts as the General Assembly. Kentucky, delegates are elected with the same qualifications and from the same districts as the lower chamber of the state legislature. Maryland sets, the legislature sets the parameters for delegate selection. Michigan uses Senate districts. Minnesota is the same as the lower house. I could go on and on through this list. A couple of them. Oklahoma provides no details. North Dakota, no details. Pennsylvania, no details. One would assume that when there are no details listed in the state's constitution about how you select delegates to a convention to propose amendments to or replace the state constitution, that it's left up to the state legislature, the very body you might be seeking to reform. According to the website Ballotopedia, the constitutions themselves range from Vermont's modest constitution of about 8,419 words, I guess that's rather precise, to Alabama's 172,000 plus words. The average is roughly 26,000, about 4 times the size of the federal constitution. New York's is twice that size in terms of the number of words. Now, that's not to say that being larger than the federal constitution is necessarily a bad thing or an out of the ordinary thing. State constitutions tend to do more and be more specific than the federal constitution. We see the federal constitution as this broad, relatively vague document left open for interpretation. State constitutions, states generally don't want to have that kind of interpretation of the document going down the road. Plus, there is this periodic mechanism built into many states where the constitutions can be changed. So why make it vague and open to interpretation if 10 or 20 years down the road you have the opportunity to change it? So make it specific. But sometimes it's a bit too specific. 172,000 words in Alabama state constitution. What the hell are they talking about? It's probably one of those cases where Mississippi can say, at least we're not Alabama. There's the old line about, states that fall low on various quality of life measures, like levels of education. Mississippi used to say, at least we're not Alabama. I've forgotten now who's last. New York's constitution is a bit overly complex, long, and surviving on sometimes awkwardly stuck-on amendments. Is it in need of an overhaul? Probably. But I would argue that given the current mechanism by which delegates are selected and some of the current politics that Jim alluded to, this may not be the time to do it. I don't oppose a constitutional convention. I've come around in the last year or so to think that this is not the time, especially given the process of selection. I'd be more apt to support a constitutional convention if we could first amend the process by which we elect the delegates and make that more fair. Perhaps more at large, or perhaps electing by assembly district, or proportional representation of counties, some other mechanism. And I think Jim and I were discussing beforehand too, that perhaps some proportional representation, not just county to county, but within counties, so that folks would have a choice, and if you had 10 delegates from a county, and 60% of the population wanted to go in one direction, 6 of the delegates would be elected that way, and 4 would be elected another. It's a mechanism that can be worked out another time. We don't need to bore you with those details. He and I can get into a battle of PhDs later and discuss how we would do that, different mechanisms. But certainly that would be a more fair way to pick delegates to a constitutional convention to ensure that everybody's voice is heard. One of the other problems I have is that members of the state legislature are not prohibited from running for or serving as delegates to the very convention, again, that we might seek to use to reform said legislature. Talk about a conflict of interest. And think about it, as an average citizen who might want to run for delegate to the state constitutional convention, how are you going to beat your incumbent assembly member or state senator? Tough to do. State senate districts, as the basis of representation, make for rather unwieldy campaigns at the local level and would tend to lower the levels of diversity among the delegates. Plus, given the relative sizes of those districts, interest groups will play a disproportionate role in the selection of delegates. That's on both sides. And I'm not taking sides with interest groups. I prefer some interest groups over others. But I don't necessarily want to roll the dice that the ones I don't like are going to dominate the selection process in my district because of the amount of money they can contribute. Some of the current concerns. And these, I just picked out 3. I have a pamphlet over there that I downloaded where there are 106 different issues. And you could take the pro or con side on each one of those that a constitutional convention could potentially raise. These are the 3 I picked out as what I thought were the 3 hottest button issues. Control of the state pension fund and the independence of the comptroller. Now, we've seen lately that the governor has backed off on his support for a constitutional convention. Could it be that every state public employee union has said no, and that may be why? You don't want to run for president when all the public employee unions in your state don't like you because you backed the Constitutional Convention. There are those who wish, whether it's the governor or not, there are those who wish to politicize control of the pension fund. Right now the pension fund is controlled by a single person who we elect. There are those who argue that that pension fund should be directed by a politically appointed board. Another issue, hot button issue, and I see some representatives of those public employee unions in the room. Protections for workers' rights, including the right to collectively bargain. There are those who argue that while New York generally is a progressive state, and you wouldn't necessarily expect it, talk to the public employee unions in Wisconsin. Oh, we're a progressive state, that'll never happen. Consideration of a unicameral legislature. This scares the daylights out of a lot of people, but one of the possible books that Karen didn't mention is one that's based on a paper I presented a few years ago at a conference, the United States of Nebraska, the case for a unicameral legislature. Nebraska is the only one of the 50 states that uses a single chamber legislature. I think New York should at least explore that possibility, perhaps to save some money. A rough back of the envelope calculation I did a number of years ago said that the state in a single year could save $81 to $100 million in salaries alone. The biggest argument you get against that is people don't want to give up the second representative they have geographically. One of the ways you can mitigate that perhaps is to increase the size of the state assembly to give more one-on-one representation. That's just 3 hot button issues that people are concerned about. You probably all have your own little pet peeve about what a state constitutional convention could or should do. And I think it is an important little d democratic process. My fear is the fear that many others have, that because of the way we select delegates, we may be electing a state constitutional convention that could damage some of the rights and freedoms we've grown accustomed to in New York. And until we change that process, I'd be hesitant about supporting a state constitutional convention. That doesn't mean if there was one called, I might not consider running for delegate. That's all I have.
Our speakers are willing to answer questions, or try to. Diane?
When
You can't refer to us by our first names because that gets confusing.
the gyms are vaccinated, for either one of you, this is about process. When the, if we pass the referendum for a constitutional convention, and then a year from now, when we vote for delegates, I would think that we would get to vote for three come from our senatorial district. Are they running on a political party? And we select three, is it a way, do we first, second choice, how does that work?
It's 3 elected district-wide currently, and there's no prohibition against partisan election of those delegates. The State Bar Association has a report which looks at the possibility perhaps of doing nonpartisan elections.
So when you think about the delegate selection, part of it's specified in the Constitution and part of it isn't. And what is in the Constitution, what isn't, varies by state. By the way, I have a website, in addition to my New York Constitutional Convention clearinghouse, I have one that covers all the state Constitutional Convention clearinghouse, which covers all 14 states and the language and the constitutions that specify them. So it is great in New York. There are problems, but it's great that the districts are specified in the Constitution. 13 of the 14 districts actually are specified, because then you don't have the gerrymandering. They may not be ideal districts, but they're specified. It reduces the potential for legislative abuse. So that's a big deal. But the Constitution doesn't specify everything, and the issues of the partisan nature of the ballot and whatnot, all those secondary items are left to the discretion of the legislature. It will be aggressively contested, and there are ways to bypass them by creating separate slates and whatnot. And so those are real concerns. I've written several op-eds specifically on how that process should be structured. And unfortunately, the legislature will not design the optimal system.
Not for us anyway, for themselves maybe.
Yes, and I think we can do better than what's in the Constitution if we had another referendum. I'm in favor of ranked choice voting within the districts and other obscure things that you won't know what we're talking about. But yes, we can't answer a lot of these questions because the details of the campaign finance and other things are not specified in the Constitution. And if we go ahead, the legislature will have control over some of those details. So that's all. I want to make one other statement. The one that's used most often for a high percentage of legislative control is 1967. It was still only 4.9% of the delegates were state legislators who were incumbents and then ran again. That's a relatively small number. I'm not aware of a single constitutional convention in the 20th century called the periodic constitutional convention referendum that had more than 10% of incumbent state delegates in the convention. And one reason for that is it's risky for, you're running for 2 different offices and you might lose, and the public doesn't really like to vote for legislators. They typically don't. So it's by no means a sure thing, and they typically lose. And legislators don't like to lose. So actually, it's not stacked in favor in front of legislators, as you're often told. If you look at the actual numbers, they're very small.
Right, and the case that I mentioned before is if you're the unfortunate ordinary citizen who wants to run and you're running in a district where an incumbent is running, you are at a disadvantage there, simply because of name recognition and ability to raise funds. Presumably, the state legislature in the call for the convention, once the referendum passed, would lay out the specifics of the selection process, and they could say nonpartisan election. I don't think that the New York State Legislature would do that. So, yeah, that's sort of up in the air, and the process part, Jim and I can get into the weeds, and we'd be here all night, but you guys all have questions.
Can the people in the back of the room hear the questions?
Yes.
That's good. Okay, if anybody speaks softly and wants to use the microphone, please do. Okay, you're next, please.
I have another question to that topic, which is just ballot access. If you wanted to be a candidate, how was that selection?
Currently, under New York State law, I would imagine, unless the legislature changes it specifically for delegates, and we're talking about the district delegates here, the same rules as for a state senate candidate would apply. So the number of signatures you'd have to gather would be the same as a state senate candidate would. I'm not sure of the number now, it's 1,200, 1,500, somewhere in that ballpark. And Denise is looking it up for me. So you'd have to get that for each delegate running in a state senate district. They're obviously much larger numbers for the 15 at-large delegates running statewide.
You know, and it's harder, actually. It says here, for your Senate district delegates right now, if you are part of an established party, you need 1,000 signatures or 5% of the enrolled party. But if you're trying to run as an independent, this is how they do it. You need 3,000 signatures or 5%.
Yeah, and the established parties, there are 8 established parties in the state of New York.
Yeah,
Democrats, Republicans, Conservatives, Independents, Green, Working Families, Reform,
women's equality.
and Women's Equality. Those are the 8 recognized parties in the state of New York that fall under that portion of the state election law. Obviously, for the smaller parties, it's the 5% and not the 1,000, so it's a much smaller number. But that means getting in your car and driving around to these individuals to get their signatures if you want to run on their lines. Statewide, it's much more restrictive, even for the independents. It's usually double or more the number of signatures for an established party. So being an independent, not an independence party member, being an independent in the state of New York is tough if you really want to be an independent and run for public office.
Okay. Mary?
Okay, a question is, you mentioned that this is a people's initiative. Well, Citizens United totally changed the definition of what the people are, and it's including the corporations have been given the same rights as people. And so I'm very concerned about the corporations will have a say in who the delegates are selected if we were to pass this Constitution. And the two things that I'm very concerned about, so that for me is the time is wrong. Until we overturn Citizens United, the time is wrong for a constitutional convention. But the two things that really concern me the most are home rule. That home rule, New York State is one of, I think, 7 states that has home rule. Home rule is critical. We have legislation in place in different towns. It gives towns and villages the right to say no to certain things in the state. And that could be overturned. And the other thing, too, is public education. The right to a public education is much stronger in New York State than it is in the U.S. government and the federal. And we could possibly lose the right to public education, especially considering the charter school movement. They would love to see public education. So I'd like you to speak to the Citizens United part and to the, or both of you, either of you. And
Yeah, just 2 things on Citizens United. First of all, the logic there when it comes to the third vote, the ratification vote, is the same whether it's a legislature-initiated referendum or a constitutional convention-initiated referendum. So basically, you'd be arguing you should create a pause to all constitutional amendment until we get rid of special interest money in the referendum process. Second element is, where is money effective in referendums? And the literature is very clear that money is most effective, far more effective if you want to kill something, rather than if you want to pass something. And so that mitigates it. People are very actually conservative on constitutional amendments. That even whether the legislature or constitutional convention proposes them, a lot of them go down, even some that seem relatively innocuous. And so the major effect of money is the ability to kill something. And one reason you can't have any poison pills today in what you propose is that somebody who doesn't like something else will focus on their poison pill and spend a lot of money and kill it. So basically the effect of Citizens United in the referendum process is to make it easier to kill things. But if something is popular, it is not a vehicle for getting things passed. So it has an asymmetric effect. So I think that tempers, I would agree, that was an unfortunate Supreme Court ruling, and I believe we do have too much money and unregulated money in politics on both the business and the labor side. And labor has been also very strongly opposed to much of the transparency, just like big business on some of these issues. So yes, it's a concern, but if we follow that too closely, our democracy can't improve, because, I mean, we still have to go ahead with our democracy. But I agree, it's a concern.
Okay, the gentleman in the last row.
You can go ahead.
Well, I just
Dora?
wanted to ask you, because it just in reference to what you just said. You just said that labor is putting a lot of money into blocking transparency. Can you explain that? In what way would they be blocking transparency?
Well, it wasn't just, in general. I've been involved with the League and Common Cause and other groups over the years. When it comes to campaign finance, the way it typically works on a partisan basis is conservatives like more labor transparency, and labor fights back, and vice versa. And the argument is that there's a lot of money in politics that is not disclosed, and both sides who benefit from money have objected to greater campaign transparency. And that's primarily, I know, Washington politics best, but that's just a basic rule of thumb. If you benefit from loopholes on either side, you want to preserve those loopholes, and the major powerful interest groups have a lot of those loopholes that they benefit from, and they don't want them shut down. So it works on both sides. Basically, any powerful interest groups will prefer the status quo. They may talk as though everybody talks that they love transparency. There's no legislator on the face of the earth who's ever been against open government. It just doesn't actually happen. And the same thing with transparency and campaign. People talk that way, but when you see what's going on in the back rooms, they tend to oppose the specific legislation to make it a reality. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back row.
Yes, you set out two forms of amendment. One is the legislative process, where the voters get to vote on a particular amendment after two successive legislations passed it. And the other is the convention process. Isn't there a missing process here, which other states have, where you can amend by popular referendum? And wouldn't it be better in New York if we first had a singular amendment to the Constitution, allowing the populace to have a referendum on a particular issue in the Constitution, rather than risking the entire Constitution to a group of delegates, none of whom have ever done this before, have no experience whatsoever, and have a one-time chance to be bought out?
Okay. I think it's very important to talk about the popular initiative. 19 states have the constitutional initiative. New York is not one of them. So I wanted to be practical. That's not an option with the current Constitution. The only two options you have now are the legislature initiative amendment and the periodic referendum. And they are, the periodic constitutional convention referendum and the popular constitutional initiative are competing institutions as legislative bypass. And I think it would be great if New York had a discussion. There's lots of different types of constitutional initiatives, popular, because that's a competing institution. But it just, as a practical matter, you don't have that now. And it's very, very hard to get the legislature to create such an institution. So I think that's a useful debate, but it's just, you've got to make a decision, and it's not something you have in New York. It's not a mechanism available in this state.
Yeah, I would agree. In terms of the practicality, New York only has the two routes available to it. And I would agree that that would be a healthy little d democratic debate to have. There's some caution, though, that has to be exercised. And while I generally err on the side of little d democracy, ask California how their initiative process has worked out for them. If not for Proposition 13 back in 1979, Arnold Schwarzenegger never would have been governor of California. It's the hamstringing of the state legislature with regard to raising revenue by Proposition 13 that caused the recall of the incumbent governor, Gray Davis. And Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor of California as a result. Now, everybody wants tax relief, and we can understand why California voted the way it did. And at the time, they had a very terrible real estate tax situation. And I'm not saying that we would go that far, but we just need to be careful about how much we popularize democracy. One of the things we believe in as a society generally, and this is most of the Western world, is in something called liberal democracy, and that's not liberal versus conservative. Here the term liberal goes back to Adam Smith and the notion of individual liberty, and that representative democracy was put in place to make sure that a majority couldn't run roughshod over a minority, that a majority of the people could not take away the rights of a minority of the people. In Colorado, a while back, they had a situation where a majority of the people voted for a particular gerrymandering scheme. The Supreme Court struck it down and said, no, you can't take away the rights of the minority. The same thing happened with Proposition 8 in California, a poorly worded public proposition that was designed to overturn the act of the legislature in granting same-sex marriage rights to the LGBTQ community. People who thought they were supporting those rights were voting against it. So on the basis of the poor wording and the fact that a popular referendum could not take away a right once granted, the Supreme Court said, well, actually it was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, said no. Never got to the Supreme Court because of the other DOMA decisions that got there first. But we need to be careful in terms of how we would structure that. I would welcome it, especially the opportunity for recall, but we would need to be careful on how we structured that initiative so that we don't end up like California.
Just one thing on the California, if you ask Californians, however much political science, some political science are question that institution. It's wildly popular in California. The reason nobody has introduced a popular initiative to ban the popular initiative, they know it would lose overwhelmingly in certain things like term limits. The only states that have term limits are those that have the popular initiative. No legislature is going to propose it, or the periodic constitutional convention. California has the most effective independent redistricting system now because it was done through popular initiative. You don't have that in New York. So there are problems, but there are good things. And
oh yeah,
the public
yep.
likes it. They love it in California, even though you can make many good arguments that it has significant
Well, and
problems.
I would say this too about the term limits issue. Many political science studies also show that states that have adopted term limits are ditching them because they don't work. What term limits end up doing is putting power in the hands of staff and interest groups and not in the hands of elected officials. There's no way you can vote a staffer or an interest group out of office. You can vote an elected official out of office. What those states that have ditched it have turned to is campaign finance reform and other reforms that are more the fly swatter that's needed rather than the sledgehammer to kill the fly on the wall. So, yeah, popular initiative and referendum can be a very good thing, and it is popular, but also ask some Californians about how much money outside the state was spent on the petition drives to put Proposition 8 and other ballot initiatives on the ballot. It became a mechanism where citizens lost control of the process, and though they like it in concept, in practice, there's much less support for it than you might think.
Thank you. You in the last row? Okay.
Okay. I think the feeling that we've got this process and we may as well go forward with it, when I think most of the people in this room would agree, the selection process stinks. Okay? You cannot have a fair representation if we're gonna use the system that's in place, which favors the way we already picked our legislators. You have to be an established party, you have to have the money. Money talks. There is no average citizen that is going to be able to go and say, oh, I'm gonna get myself elected. You're not going to be. You couldn't give up your job for the year or two or whatever it is. So who's got the money to do that? The people that are already in the system, who know how to game the system up. Most of us wouldn't even know how to go get a petition. What are the rules for petitions? Where do I hand them in? Who can I get the list from? It's set up for the people that are already in the system. So please do not tell me that I should go ahead and have this and hope that when it actually comes to a vote, first of all, there's no guarantee how it comes to a vote. They could have a horrendous thing in there, put them all into one yes or no. Okay? If I had something that I knew most people did not like, I would lump it with a whole bunch of things that the people want. And we would have one up and down vote. It does not tell us how they have to put it on the ballot. They can decide how to put it on the ballot. I do not have the confidence in the system because of the way they're being selected. If we could fix, and it'd be a true people's convention, because the selection process would be more transparent and more fair, fine. But I am not gonna put my faith in the system that we've already got in place to pick rational people to come up with something that was good for everybody.
Should we respond, or? I guess-
Yes, if
Okay.
you'd like to.
I just want to say there are no guarantees in the democratic process. The Supreme Court is 9 unelected individuals who have life terms. They could tomorrow turn around and rule anything. They could do anything they wanted, and there would be no check on it. The legislature could raise, they could tax you 100% of your income and take away all your property. This is the way democracy works, but they don't, because they want to get elected. Here, the major check is all this body can do is propose things, and you can vote. If you don't like it, you vote it down. And one of the most remarkable things that I have found through studying these conventions, I showed a bunch of documentaries of the American Political Science Association, is whenever they look at these conventions retrospectively, they make them into these wonderful hagiographic things with wonderful statesmen and leaders in them. And then, so that's one. And we're talking about many in the 20th century. You look back retrospectively, we think they were great conventions, but then when you look forward, there's all this concern about what might happen. And anyway, there are no guarantees, but at the end of the process, you can just veto the whole thing. So the worst case scenario just isn't there. And I think you have to have some trust in the people to do that.
I have trust in the people, I just don't have trust in the system.
Yeah.
Yes. Dora, you've been waving your hand a while.
I just want to say this. I agree with Jim. I'm a history teacher. In theory, I think a constitutional convention. In theory, in a perfect world, that would be what we want. But if we lived in a perfect world, we wouldn't have the leader of our nation invading North Korea. So we live in the political climate we have now. And you said, we could vote it down. In 1967, they rolled it all into one, including a repeal of the Blaine Amendment, which would have allowed public money to go to private parochial schools. It was voted down. So, okay, so maybe that's good then. But it cost $50 million. And the delegates there receive salaries and pensions. So if, like Nancy said, if we knew that the process worked, not only do we not believe in the delegate selection, but the process itself. Once those delegates are elected, they decide how the process works. They decide the duration, the scope, how long, where they meet. That is entirely their decision. Am I right?
Well, just like any legislature, it's always the prerogative of a body to turn its internal procedures, because otherwise the checks and balance system would be violated. So you have to give them control over their internal control. Nobody can say how the committee system of Congress is structured or how they elect the chair. That's an internal issue to the public body.
Parameters could be set though. I don't see why that has to be a given. Why parameters couldn't be set ahead of time. Right now, we're asked to engage in this civic wonder without any information other than its democracy. And like Jim said, I'm going to agree with you twice here, Jim.
Yeah.
There is so much to lose. There is so much at risk. And at this point in time, I don't know that anybody in this room would give that trust over to delegates. And you said that, only a couple of them, 3%, but the leader, the president of the convention was also the speaker of the assembly. Most of the people had either connections, law connections, or political connections. They certainly weren't Dora Leland teaching middle school in 7th grade. So if you look at the true demographics of that 67 convention, they didn't represent the people that they were elected for.
Let me, I'd like to follow up on that too. Before I came here tonight, I went to the League of Women Voters analysis of the 67 convention, okay? 70% of them were lawyers, according to the League of Women Voters. More than half were over 50 years old. Only 33 were under 40. New York City and the suburbs commanded 62% of the delegates. Rural areas only got represented by 24% of the delegates, and this was in '67. I'm sure the percentage of rural delegates is going to be even smaller given the population decline. So it may benefit certain segments of the society. We have a fairly progressive, I would view, constitution. But I agree with that, Jim, that this is not the climate. This is the most partisan divide that I've seen since the Vietnam War, actually. I never thought I would see what is happening at the federal level, where I see every department, from education to environment to stuff, where people are being installed to undermine the mission of that agency. So you bring up a point that with Citizens United, that the easiest thing is to kill something and da-da-da-da-da. I somewhat understand the point that was being made earlier, okay? That for me, if you want to be a delegate, I'm sure that money from outside of New York is going to come in because of the interest that potentially is at play here. Your whole Constitution's up in the air. So I can see a scenario where enough progressive goodies are put in to maybe take care of downstate, da-da-da-da-da. But I can also see a scenario where there is limits imposed on potentially upstate, that would pass if it's done as a whole. You're right, we get to vote potentially if it's at, every proposal is broken down. And the thing that gets me even about this election is you're gonna have every delegate running out there, anti-corruption, transparency, but correct me if I'm wrong, with the last constitutional there were a couple of hot button issues that delegates ran on. I think Blaine was one, okay? But I think they came out with 24 or something like, I don't recall the exact number of amendments that weren't even part of the discussion during the election cycle. That's not true?
No. But even if it was true, unlike a legislative proposed amendment where it's done, just before the legislature recesses, it's out there for the public for 6 weeks or more to look at. But everything that was in there was discussed, but that's a secondary issue.
Not during the election cycle. When you're electing these delegates, yes, eventually,
sure.
when you're electing these delegates, they're gonna tell you what you wanna hear. What I'm saying is what actually gets put on the table, okay, you don't know. You don't know what is gonna be proposed.
I consider that good. In fact, I consider it highly detrimental when people talk about the specifics so much and the public expects that. When George Washington, who's part of the Federal Constitutional Convention, he had almost no idea what was going to be discussed there. He went in there to listen and learn. Most of the issues he hadn't thought about at all. And I think what you really want in a delegate is a thoughtful person. You can't possibly know all the issues. And even if you did, people like Madison came into that convention with an agenda. By the time he was done, the Federal Constitution looked very different than anything he thought. What you want are thoughtful people who can absorb information and whatnot. So it's a premise.
That's back in the day when you had statesmen and not politicians.
Okay, but the basic question that I would like is, in New York, the debate is heavily focused on the 1967 precedent. I think it's a useful precedent, but remember, we've had 236 state constitutional conventions in America. And it would be like, when the Yankees lose a game, to infer, because they lost one game, they're gonna lose the rest of the season and they didn't learn anything from that game. I would encourage you to look at, say, the 1970 Illinois State Constitutional Convention. Illinois, Chicago's the second largest city, it was then after New York. I consider that a very successful convention. I think they had 1.9% incumbent legislators there. One of the people who was active in the campaign was the chair. They did the conventional approach of having multiple amendments, a non-controversial bunch, and then they put the controversial ones in separate amendments. So you don't just have to pick that one. I mean, it's New York, but there are many other examples to learn from. You shouldn't focus too much on just one example.
Since that was the last one.
I know, it's a logical one, but there's many others that have happened since then and before then that I think should be also reference points as part of the discussion. That's my only point about that.
Thank you. Another question, please?
From hearing the discussion that's going on in the group, I guess my feeling is posing to you as our resident experts is we have 2 other proposals that are going to be on the ballot. Why aren't we focusing for next year's vote that we write another proposal to, like the corruption and the land deal, that we overhaul our current system so these 204 people are appointed or elected, however, in a more democratic fashion. And the 2 of you obviously have lots of ideas on how that could happen so that there's more equality and we're not having people that are going to be immediately left out of the process. So why aren't we writing something or proposing something that say, right now, we're gonna vote no because it's stacked against
Well,
us
it's a
or feeling
catch-22
that.
situation. The
But we can write a
legislature would
proposal.
never propose the type of things that you'd like to see. So it's a great idea, except it's a catch-22.
But if we put enough heat under them to do it,
Well, that's the thing, in next year's election cycle, assume for a moment that the referendum is defeated, and
right,
we want to go in the direction you're talking about, because we do have a constitution that probably could use some serious reform.
right.
But we're afraid of what might happen in a convention that could run away. If we want to make sure that it's more representative of the people, and we want to change the process, then the day after Election Day this year, it's up to groups and communities
To
to start getting together and
start
saying, this
heating
is
up
what we
that pot.
want, and beat up your representatives
Yes.
in the Assembly and in the Senate, and say, we want a proposition on the ballot to change the way a constitutional convention is established.
But you 2 are our resident experts. We need something that we can put in front of them, because we all know, if you go to your boss, you go to your principal, you go to whoever's in head, and you say, this is a problem, and it needs to be fixed, and look, I have these 3 possible solutions of what we could do, they're gonna listen much more than if we say, we got a problem, fix it. We need to have something in hand to give them.
I have written 2 op-eds exactly on that subject, that I advocate something that's gonna be beyond here, because we don't have it in the United States. I recommend a mixed member proportional system, which Germany and New Zealand have, which I think is the best type of electoral system for a delegate selection process. We discussed that moving, but that would be way too technical to discuss here. But I cannot imagine the legislature doing that. That's just, in terms of the world. The reason we have a checks and balance system is because we recognize that each branch has some conflicts.
But the power of the media can put a whole lot of heat on them.
Hopefully, yeah.
I'll be talking about this subject tomorrow night.
Okay.
Regular segment politics in 2.
Excuse me, but there is a resource sheet at the back of the room which lists several sources, but also the one article that this Jim is talking about. It's the best way to select delegates. So if you look that up, then you can read more about this system he's talking about.
That'd be great, thank you.
Mhm. The lady in
The purple.
Purple?
Yeah, she's been
A
doing it.
concern that I have not really heard mentioned tonight, and as a New York State taxpayer, I want to know where the money's going to come for this millions of
400
dollars,
million.
Convention. Where is the money coming from? I know that, but
Is that from me?
No. I mean, it's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
I'm tempted to answer it by saying the government hasn't really advertised this referendum, so it won't have to pay that money. But that's just all.
Now, that's the money to pay the people after, if it is opened. You gotta pay all these people that $300 a day plus all their expenses. That's
Times
gonna add up fast.
204, right? Right? They get paid.
Plus staff.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If I could just respond very briefly, this has been very heavily discussed in the media, these numbers, and they are highly contested. If you look at the opposition website, it says 300 billion. If you work out the numbers, the scholars who have looked at it, there was a great, I would call it an expose in Politico, New York. That would work out to about $1.5 million per delegate. And I think common sense, if it was the $340 million figure with 200 delegates, it's a preposterous number. The math was based on somebody extrapolated from the original cost with inflation.
From
And
67,
they calculated the inflation factor twice. That's how they originally got to the 300. So the original one, and it was very expensive actually in New York compared to Illinois and other states. At 11, they went from 11 million to 300 million. Those scholars who've looked at it think we're talking about a max of maybe 100 million. New York has one of the more expensive ones because it does specify in the Constitution how much the delegates should be paid. And I think for a very good reason, because typically we don't want competing branches to determine the pay of somebody in another branch, because you can't reduce the Supreme Court judge's salary during the term and whatnot. So by specifying the pay, you got rid of a problem. Like in Rhode Island, they didn't specify the pay in the Constitution, and the legislature was constantly threatening to take away the pay of the delegates. So there's a problem. Remember, we're talking about a budget of about $160 billion a year. This is rounding change, and I think it's very interesting that in the early conventions, when New York was 1/100th of the size it is now, the people were much poorer. There was no discussion in 1846 about the cost of a convention. It's only in these small states that have these conventions. It somehow becomes a big issue because nobody disagrees that spending money is a good idea. It's one of the safest type of argument. People think, oh, that's a lot of money. It's a incredibly small amount. When you poll New Yorkers and how much do they think of as wasted government, you get incredible numbers like 30 or 40% of the budget they think is wasted. You know, businesses routinely spend 1% or so on control mechanisms, accountability. Even if it was 300 million, and I've articulated why many very thoughtful people think that's an absurd number, it's still a tiny amount. If you just think of what we spent on the Second Avenue subway, $4.1 million for 2 miles, You know, we're talking about 500 feet or 1,000 feet of the second city subway, but it does sound like a big number.
I'm sorry, look, that fallacious argument can be made about anything you want to spend money on. I mean, that holds no water. If you compare that with every budget item, we would be bankrupt. Just to say 150 million, well, we spend it on other things. That argument can be used on every single budget item. Excuse me, but that's fallacious reasoning, and you should stop that. You know that, you know that.
Well, just very briefly, the theory of budgeting is you should always, for every proposed budget, somebody should be able to say, oh, we can spend the money better on something else. So the binary comparisons is actually an appropriate way to think about trade-offs, economic trade-offs.
Yes.
So I think the concerns about what might happen bad are definitely worth thinking about and being concerned about. But I'm just curious if you could each describe if you think there's something good that might come out of it, and it's, for example, something that might reduce the level of corruption or improve the way the government works somehow. Do you guys think there's a chance that something good like that might come out of it, and what would it be?
I have many things, most of them are pretty obscure, but.
No, I mean,
I would-
I mean, like, it has a real chance of actually happening. Like, if we do this, like, something that really has a good chance that could make things better. That's what I'm asking.
I'll pick a really trivial one that has been, I've invested quite a bit of time in, it's one of my favorite areas of research, is updating the journal clause. So almost every constitution has a journal clause which says that you have to record the votes. You have elected representatives, we live in a representative body, you should know how they vote. And and that's in the federal constitution as well as the New York Constitution. And that's a very outdated clause. I did a study of the 99 state legislatures. Nebraska is the one with the unicameral one, that's the one, it's not 100. And the big states like New York do not allow you to look at roll call votes by individual your representative. You can't look up and see how your representative voted. They just don't do it. They don't make those votes also available in machine-readable format. Now, I think that's a disgrace. Small states like Vermont and Maine and New Hampshire do that, but not. And there are many things that the journal clause should be updated. They don't want to do it because the first thing an opposition candidate does is and also lobbyists do, that pay huge amounts of money, is they want to be able to analyze how individuals voted officially. It's a disgrace that the legislation doesn't do it, and it should be, the journal clause should be updated to the modern world. And you should not have to depend on the legislature to display their own activity. It should be available so third parties can take the raw material, mash it up, and actually present useful information to constituents. They have a very pretty website, but not a useful website. So I would update the journal clause. The whole structure of ballot access, I think, is barbaric in New York also, but I've written an article about that. We need to open up the ballot. The control that the government has on the display of the ballot is completely unnecessary with modern technology. So we need to rethink that. We'd get rid of a lot of the petition signature problems and whatnot if we had a modern structured ballot. So there are many things like that, and I think they would come out in a discussion. And one of the things that really appeals to me about a convention is most people don't have any incentive to think about these issues because they know that a lot happen. But you create a convention and all sorts of people and ideas come out of the woodwork because finally there's a chance that something might happen. And one of my biggest problems with the good government groups is I don't think they're really very thoughtful and creative because they're sort of, most of the time they walk around, it's hopeless to do things. But here, it would unleash tremendous creative energy, and I think there's a very strong track record for that.
I would agree that the dynamics in the room could lead to something very productive. I would disagree on ballot access. I think going around door to door and getting signatures to get on the ballot is a much more little d democratic way to get on the ballot than any other way that we could do it. And I've been there, I've done it, I've gone door to door, I've been out in snowstorms in Buffalo getting signatures to get delegates on the ballot for a Democratic National Convention. I've been out in near hailstorms in June and July getting signatures. It's an important part of the political process, and I don't think we should do away with that. But that's a personal disagreement between
Oh,
us.
no, I'm actually not proposing that at all. I think you didn't understand what I was proposing.
But I also think that
Tactical, I think, to go into there.
possibly, if you get these individuals, if we can get the free thinkers, those who are open to new ideas and creative ways of governing, there is the possibility you could see reforms on ethics, a real ethics law with some elected official with the real power to investigate and put other elected officials in jail if they violate the public trust. I personally would like to see such a convention explore the possibility of going to a unicameral legislature. The main reason we have a two-chamber legislature anywhere in the world is because that the upper chamber, its history is a chamber of the nobility. That's what it was for. The upper chamber of any legislative body, think of the United Kingdom's parliament. The House of Lords is the upper chamber. The United States Senate was created not for that purpose, but for the purposes of a compromise, to ensure that small states had equal representation with large states, and the House of Representatives was by population. If you no longer have that compromise, or the need for it, the Supreme Court case of Reynolds v. Sims from the 1960s said that having an upper chamber in a state legislature that represented political units was unconstitutional, because it didn't have one person, one vote as its basis. So I would argue Reynolds versus Sims 50+ years ago made the upper chamber of state legislatures obsolete. And there's no need for them. So I would like to see a constitutional convention at least look at that idea. Is it viable for New York? I don't like the idea that Nebraska uses with nonpartisan elections. Because with nonpartisan elections, I think what you get is more domination of the political process by the wealthy elites than you do now. I mean, we have a problem with campaign finance, yes, but if you take away party labels, it's billionaires galore. So I would like to see a constitutional convention address real structural change in New York, maybe get rid of the upper chamber, look for campaign finance reform, stronger ethics laws, and if we do get a convention without a reform process, that this convention would address a process that would work better in the future. So those are the kinds of things I would hope that would come out of a convention. I wouldn't want to see it create a politically appointed board or commission to govern the state pension fund. I'd rather be able to throw the bum out if he's not doing a good job. Not that Tom DiNapoli's doing a bad job, he's a personal friend of ours, and I don't want to see him thrown out of office.
Okay, thanks. Before we continue, there's another component to our program, and that is the open mic. Are there people here who want to save room for open mic? Or is this question and answer period doing the same thing for you?
Yeah, I think that's fine. And I have a question.
Okay. Next then?
We've heard volumes of information tonight, and we need to take this show on the road because the general public has no sense of what is happening here. And I would like to know where can we go and get some specific bullets that we can help educate the public regarding constitutional convention, because many people are going to flip that ballot over and have no sense of whether they should vote yes or no, or maybe not even flip it over, not knowing it even on there. And I just, one of the challenges that I've been asked to do is to help educate the public. And so with short attention spans, we can't possibly share what we've heard tonight, that they would be speak on us. But if we could go somewhere and get some specific bullets to.
Some of the information back there has
Jim's website is excellent.
Jim's website, okay.
Ballotopedia has a great deal of information about process.
I'd be willing to share them.
and from the back table too.
From the where?
Back table.
And Dora said she would be willing to come and talk to anybody for it.
Okay. All set. Let's see, some new faces then. You please?
Well, here we are in a meeting that's sponsored by League of Women Voters. I'd like to say, what would both of you suggest as a solution to the 3 men in a room?
We solved that, there's 5 men in a room there.
5 men?
Well, under Spitzer, he introduced the concept of having the minority leaders from both chambers in as well.
I think the three men rule is closely allied to the unicameral proposal, because what you would want to have is one legislature that really isn't a legislature, but one man controls the legislation, everybody is fearful of that one legislature. So you have to look, what are the points of leverage that the assembly chair has? One of the really critical points is he controls the districts. So if you piss off the assembly leader, he can just.
And staff.
Yeah,
All sorts of perks.
he can basically get rid of your district, and it often happens. So if you cannot go up against the leadership, because it's gonna destroy your next, or if that period, you can't, and there are those points of leverage, if we had an independent redistricting, that would eliminate the significant point of leverage, I think, of the chair that terrifies the membership to cross it.
And that's another thing I think we would both agree should come out of a constitutional convention is take redistricting out of the hands of the
So
elected.
if you're gonna go with unicameral, you have to fix up the three man in the room problem, because you don't wanna have the tyranny of the legislative chair. There are many other proposals. I think the gerrymandering is one, enforcing the 72-hour disclosure rule, because they get in the room at the last minute, everything is done. The legislators haven't even read the bills, and they're actually law. With the convention, they can just propose it. And so these problems have to be solved before you can seriously propose a unicameral legislature. So it's a very important problem.
2 points. Ask Mike Bragman about the three men in a room, or actually about the punishment of the speaker. He led a coup against Shelley Silver in the late 1990s, and he found himself he was the majority leader of the state assembly. After he led the coup and failed, he found himself with a basement office in the legislative office building. Those are the kinds of things the speaker controls. With respect to three men in a room, when Nelson Rockefeller became governor, he fought for years against a disjointed legislature that couldn't seem to agree on what time of day it was. And the three men in the room, when it was initially introduced, was a way to get the legislature and the governor communicating. It was actually a positive reform at the time. It became institutionalized and bogged down in this, if these three guys agree on it, and it was always men, if these three guys agreed on it, it became law, regardless of what the rest of the chamber wanted. So it started out as a reform, an extra constitutional reform, if you will, a political attempt to change things, and it became institutionalized and just screwed up the way the state governed itself. But yeah, and I think that yes, you need to get rid of that, but a unicameral legislature that is more parliamentary in nature would probably avoid the three men in a room situation, if you could implement it. Getting to it is getting around.
And I just want to add, the author of the book of Three Men in the Room came out with a revised edition recently, in which he has a chapter endorsing a state constitutional convention. And just for those of you who don't know, the three men in the room idea is that New York government is not really run by a legislature with many individuals, that the entire government is really decided by the governor and the heads of the House and the Senate, and the rest doesn't really matter. And what you want to do is disperse power, so when you elect a legislature that actually can do something.
Yeah, Denise points out that now with the independent Democratic caucus in the Senate, there's actually a fourth person in the room, the leader of that caucus, that goes whichever way they think they're going to get their bread buttered with the Democrats or the Republicans in the state Senate. So there's actually four people in the room now. I guess David Patterson and Governor Cuomo didn't like the 5 men in a room that Spitzer implemented.
Thank you. We'll be winding up shortly. We'll have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Darren?
Yeah, this is actually more of a comment, but based on what I've heard tonight, there is a qualitative difference between the vote to start the process and the vote on the final product. And in a way, it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. If people are familiar with the experiment, is you put a cat in a sealed box with poison, and as long as the box is sealed, you don't know whether the cat is alive or dead. And you only know by opening the box. And I think opening the box is that first vote. And so, and I also believe there should be a litmus test for the final product, in that are the things that are included in that final vote, things that are structurally changes the state government to make it more participatory and more open, or is it just removing or adding things which again might actually harm certain entrenched rights and freedoms? So I believe that's the litmus test, but I would much rather vote to start the process in order to vote down a constitutional change that stinks to high heaven. So strategically, I would say that the best avenue is to vote yes on the first one, and then of course, if it's horrible on the second one, then just go ahead and vote the final product down. So that's just my opinion on it.
Okay, thank you, Darren. Dara?
I just have one last comment, and it's gonna be almost contrary to what you just said. I'm not a gambler. And I think that's what is being asked of us. I think the possibilities are amazing, and what could happen would be wonderful. But then I look at the news every day. I see people coming out of Albany in handcuffs. I see the lobbying that I do to legislators who say not the nicest things to the teachers and the people that come in to lobby them. And I think we're going into a process that we really can't see. We don't know what the delegates will be like. We don't know what the process is going to be like. There's no guarantee that anything would get done. There's no guarantee that something will get done that will take away the things that we value today. So guess what we're being asked to do is, how much are you willing to risk? How much are we willing to trust that it's going to be okay? You know, November 8th, I trusted in the people of this country. And I don't know that I'd be willing to make that risk again. I think that there's a lot to be said. And I think if we could fix the system, if we could set it so that our delegate selection was better, the parameters were set, there was more transparency in the process, I think then we could go to that place. But I think asking people to trust a system that is so broken, it's like, you know, when we had the Wall Street bailout and the hedge fund managers fixed it. I almost feel a little bit of deja vu here right now. That's all that I can say.
Just the last comment. Voter apathy. This is on the ballot for this year, off election year. And in your esteemed estimates, what are the chances that even a slight possibility of a majority of people even know what it's all about? To vote on, informed, to be an informed voter.
Well, the level of knowledge is very low. Most people aren't even aware that they don't know that they have a state constitution. They don't know.
Even to turn over the ballot.
They're not taught in school. It's just not part of the curriculum, and people haven't experienced it. They have at least an intuition about candidate races, and when they get in the ballot, most people don't know, but they can vote Democratic or Republican. They have some simple things, and so it's a problem. The way it typically works out is most people don't know, and there's a vast amount of money spent the last week or two against it. It's absolutely incredible cost, all the risk, the Pandora's box. And so the undecided, oh, this sounds scary, and they'll vote against it. And so again and again, in New York in 1997, it was ahead in the polls at this point in many other states, and on no side, which in practice has unlimited funds and motive to spend them, will spend the money
Well, why
and
are you
it'll
all
switch.
saying that the no people have this nefarious motive?
No, I'm not saying nefarious. What I'm saying is, having studied in different states where the resources are, like in Connecticut, they were ahead by almost 20%, and the no side outspent the yes one 49-1. I'm talking about the resources. And the part that I do have a problem, the 300 million type of figures, to me, the Pandora's box argument is completely wrong. The whole virtue of a constitutional convention is that the legislature cannot limit the agenda. So to me, that is the greatest plus, and when I see people disparaging the greatest feature, it's a problem for me. So that's where I'm coming from. I think I explained that in the opening.
But there are nefarious people on both sides.
Oh, sure, oh, yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
That's
And quickly, in response to Jim's point about the scheduling of the vote, yes, it's in an odd year where we have only local elections and turnout is minimal to begin with. So that's another problem with the scheduling. If you want people to be aware of whatever your particular argument is, whether you're in favor of a constitutional amendment or a constitutional convention or opposed to it, you need to educate your friends and neighbors. Get them to forums like this, point them to the websites, inform them and let them go out and make an educated vote and get them to the polls. Our turnout in off-year elections, next year is not an off-year election, next year is a midterm election. Don't let people in the media fool you and tell you that next year is an off-year election. This is an off-year election. Turnout in off-year elections is abysmal.
Thank you.
Turnout in midterm elections is awful. Turnout in presidential elections is meh.
33%.
We don't turn out to vote. And even on important issues, whatever you think, yes or no, even on important issues, like deciding whether or not to restructure your state government, people just go, they don't care. Yet they'll complain about taxes, they'll complain about their elected officials. You have a chance to decide how the rules are going to be written, or whether they're going to be rewritten or not. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your relatives, learn, go out and vote. In political science, we also have this thing we talk about called the vote paradox. We turn out to vote in presidential election years, and there's a little mathematical equation I write on the board for my students, or a comparison, an inequality. Let's assume that 100 million people vote in a presidential election year. The value of your vote is 1 over 100 million. We don't turn out much in off-year elections or school board elections, so let's assume you live in a very heavily populated school district where 10,000 people show up to vote. Your vote value is 1 over 10,000. Which is worth more? Which is a bigger number? 1 over 10,000. You want another little tidbit of information to pass on to your friends and neighbors about the importance of voting in local elections? The single largest contributor to your tax obligation is your local school board elections. Not who gets elected president of the United States and what they can or can't do to your income taxes. Your local school board, your town board, city council, county legislature, the largest portion of your tax burden comes from local government, not the federal government. So if you want to complain about high taxes, vote in November, not next year.
While we're clapping for them, let's give them a really big hand because they made a lot of personal sacrifices to get here tonight and enlighten us as they did. Thank you so much. And to you good citizens, I'd like to commend you on putting them to work like you did and trying to learn a lot about this complex subject. I'll leave you with one quote, George Bernard Shaw. Democracy is a device that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve.
And a hand for Karen.
Yes.